My narcissistic mom wore a white dress to an Indian wedding thinking she'd upstage my beautiful bride. But she looked ugly and was embarrassed the entire time. I don't have a good relationship with my mother because she was the type to demand gifts on my birthday because I wouldn't be here without her. For 18 years, I never got to open presents myself. Every event, from my games to graduation, was always about her. I always felt like my life and achievements were just an extension of her accomplishments. I think I suppressed my resentment because everyone around me always acted like this was normal. I didn't know how to cope with this, so I just tried to get as far away from her as possible. I applied to the furthest university I could realistically get in, and stayed far away because any time I had to go back home, it was the same story. At university I was lucky enough to meet Pia, and for the first time I started to like who I was. I didn't feel like I had to hide or play down my accomplishments, or even my failures. And her family was so warm and welcoming, it felt like my childhood was just a nightmare of the past. I thought the best way to move past it was to just move ahead. I was ashamed of my mother's behavior, and the ugliness of my resentment, so I pretended everything was fine, and invited my parents to my wedding with Pia. I actually had a really clear vision of what I wanted in the wedding, just an event that would be about me and not my mother. These suppressed feelings led to me unfairly lashing out at Pia when my mother tried her old tricks and asked to wear white to our wedding. At that moment I forgot white wasn't the bridal color in Indian weddings. I just felt a cold sweat that another precious moment would be hijacked by my mother. Pia and I got into a fight about her letting my mother wear white, but she said it was okay because there was no way a simple white dress was going to outdo her wedding look. And for a while, everything was fine, until unwanted memories kept invading my head. No matter how much I tried to bury my head in work or exhaust myself by exercising, they always came back. I ended up having an actual meltdown that night. I was sobbing and crying. It was probably my ugliest moment. The next morning I half expected to wake up alone, and get a text that the wedding was off. Instead, incredibly, Pia stayed with me. She convinced me to go to therapy, encouraged me through those first few hellish sessions, and gave me space when I needed it. Therapy really helped. I was able to understand why I was feeling angry and upset, and how to deal with it beyond just trying to ignore it. I apologized to Pia earlier, but it let me actually be honest with her about my family. It really transformed our relationship. I took over the wedding preparation with the help of my in-laws, and I got to actually design my dream wedding. My mother-in-law later told me she was really relieved that we switched because my lovely Pia didn't really care about the colors or flowers, and had virtually no input on any of it as long as we were getting married. My mother-in-law was also very encouraging and patient in letting me voice my input. The actual wedding went really beautifully. Pia was ready to rescind my parents' invitations completely after everything, but her terrifying little sister suggested we invite anyway as a final sort of FU, to show them I wasn't alone anymore and no matter what they tried this time, things would go my way. I have to admit that did appeal to me, so we decided to invite them for the third day of the ceremony, and it worked even better than I imagined. First, it helped that my mother had no real idea what an Indian wedding is like, so when she showed up in a long white tulle ball gown, security actually thought she had the wrong address and didn't let her in. This was actually something I didn't plan, but I felt such joy seeing my mother fuming by the gate while other guests were let in. Compared to the embroidered silks and sleek satins of Indian clothes, my mother's ball gown honestly looked frumpy. Instead of stealing the show, she just looked like she didn't belong. Then my mother tried really hard to interrupt the ceremony. First she tried coughing, but luckily Pia's aunt sitting next to her gave her a cough drop. Then she tried to initiate a conversation, but Pia's 5-year-old niece loudly said, "Don't you know it's rude to talk during weddings? I'm 5 and I know that." I later learned that she had been coached to respond this way by my wonderful, terrifying sister-in-law. The third time she tried to interrupt, Pia's cousin, who had also been coached by sister-in-law, jumped and loudly whispered that the food didn't seem to agree with my mother and needed to go to the bathroom immediately, and basically pushed her away. After that she stayed embarrassedly quiet for the rest of the ceremony. Throughout all this, everyone else acted like she wasn't there. In the after-party, the difference between my mother and everyone else was unpleasantly accented by her ignorance of Bollywood/Tollywood dance skills, so she tried to refocus attention through conversation. She turned to my mother-in-law and started to complain about how hard it was to raise me. My mother-in-law, bless her heart, said, "However difficult children are, they bring 10 times as much happiness just by growing. Your son is such a wonderful young man, you must be so proud of him." My mother didn't like the direction of the conversation, so she turned to Pia and asked her if she was sure she wanted to be with me. This was after we had gotten married. Pia looked at her like she was a bit slow and said, "Why would I be marrying him if I wasn't sure?" My mother loudly asked her again if she was really sure because I used to wet the bed. I haven't done that since I was 8, but there she was, loudly announcing it for all and sundry. At that moment, I really hated her. It felt like there was something stuck in my throat, and no words came out. But Pia didn't have that problem. "You must be confused," she said, and it was so confident with a touch of concern that my mother looked like she was actually confused. Then she raised her voice so it could be heard over the music. "Dear mother-in-law, I know we are family now, but it's much too soon right now, or ever, for me to hear about your bedroom activities." Then she dragged me away to the dance floor while people started to stare at my mother. Stupidly, the first thing I said in our first dance as a married couple was that my mother was right. But because I am the luckiest man alive, Pia just squeezed my hand and told me it happens when children are put under stress and it wasn't my fault. That was pretty much the end of the problem, and I enjoyed the rest of my wedding dancing, eating food and talking with Pia, and now my wonderful family. By the end of the day, my mother looked incredibly constipated, but she hadn't managed to ruin anything. I felt so relieved when I said goodbye, like a weight had just slipped off my feet and my knees felt weak. It was the first time in my life that she hadn't taken over something that was supposed to be about me. After that day, I haven't had any sudden invasive memories of the past. I feel so incredibly lucky to have married this girl.